Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 93 Fuzzy, Furry, Quilted, Knit, and Ribbed. Morning, everybody. Good afternoon, wherever you are at, whatever time it is. I am happy to have you in here. Happy Friday and happy time for the Takeup. Glad to have you guys in on this busy Friday afternoon. It's been a very busy day for me, but happy to have you guys in and listening as we talk about some of our favorite fabrics. I say favorite, maybe with quotes, because some of us don't feel very much like we love these fabrics all the time, considering they can be difficult for us to embroider. But as we get into the winter, into the holiday season, it is invariable that we will be asked to stitch on something that is fuzzy, furry, ribbed, knit, that has a high pile that is difficult to control. And we're going to talk about a few different things around that, about texture, about shifting, about the different things we have to do. Probably going to make it a slightly shorter episode this time around, hopefully, that we can kind of get in, get out. I've talked about this one a lot, but I know lots of people ask me questions, and there's one burning question about knockdown stitching and nap tack or whatever other kinds of stitching. There's a bunch of different ones they call them because Embrilliance has the trademark term knockdown. I'm going to say knockdown because I'm going to show something from our tools and from my personal digitizing strategies for dealing with stuff that is loopy and loose and has texture. But the thing is, with knockdown, there's some burning questions about how people like to do it and why. And I'm going to give you at least my take on why I use the settings I do, why I use the kind of knockdown that I do. So that's the kind of thing I'm going to talk about. Certainly, as far as the digitizing side, we'll also be discussing things about quilted materials, puffer coats, stuff like that, things that shift in the hoop. Talk a little bit about hooping, a little bit about what we can do on the digitizing side and the execution side, and try and cover all of that. Like I said, shorter show today, a little technical. It's been a very busy day. So for me, I have to say a little bit more frenetic pace than usual. Lots of stuff going on. But I think we've got lots of content we can share with you that'll be useful and help everybody out. And to that end, first thing I'm going to do is make sure you guys know that there is a good size links list this time around. We actually have quite a bit of information on there. And I'll go ahead and throw that up on the stream just to kind of show you what I have in there. We have some fun celebration stuff that I'll talk about in a minute. I had a lovely honor this morning that we'll discuss. But in the links list, you're going to find a couple of my classic articles that deal with all manner of sort of underlay settings and styles. It actually will tell you the actual settings that I use in digitizing, so that you can digitize these things with a standard tatami or fill stitch. Those settings are there in my articles. So some of my classic articles are there for about taming texture. We have that. We also have the section on knit caps. I'm not going to get super deep into the specifics of knit caps today. We're just going to talk mostly about dealing with the material itself, but that's also there in the links list for you to get a hold of. There's a lovely article from Images Magazine that's kind of a more modern take and an online take, just showing you how to do what I call the light mesh fill, which is also the same as a bidirectional knockdown, which I'm also going to show you in software later on, so we can talk about what I do as far as knocking down high pile fabrics that are textured, that have gaps and ribs. Also, good piece from Printwear Magazine, the original piece that started it all, where I discuss this stuff and show you some examples on fleece, knits, and the like. Uh, there's also another one where it discusses t-shirts, because what people forget is some of the things that we have issues with as far as knits and textures. We think of it on the macro scale. We think about rib knit toques and beanies and stuff, and think that that's the thing that we're really dealing with is heavy ribs or corduroys. But truth of the matter, we'll get to this later as well. We have textural things that can happen with t-shirts. T-shirts are a jersey knit, and they have a distinct grain and stretch. And there's a little bit we'll be taking into account there, because on the micro scale, the same stuff that happens in t-shirt knit is what's happening in a larger chunky knit that we expect from a sweater or something ribbed. And this is something we can discuss and essentially get to kind of the bottom of how these interactions between the stitches and the knit happen. But that is also there as an article. So we got some reading material if you want. Also, a couple of videos present. The original video where I go really deep on this subject is there, episode 30. You can get a hold of that if you want to check that out. A couple example videos of hooping, and then we have links to the shows that I have coming up shortly, DAX and also the Impressions Expo. So all that coming up, but it's also available in the links list. And I'm going to go ahead and grab that, copy that for you guys who are here live. It'll be in the comments for you to get a hold of. If not, hopefully that was up on screen long enough for everybody who's just watching to grab that. Let's go ahead and just grab that, and it is now in the links. So anybody who's here, by the way, we are now also streaming on LinkedIn. So if you're on LinkedIn, I'm not sure I can see your comments or not. I can't post comments directly to the LinkedIn Live, but please ask questions there and I will come back and answer them later via commentary. So now live on Facebook, live on YouTube, live on LinkedIn. So awesome to have you guys all here. Everybody who's watching, I sincerely appreciate you being here. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and drop that out of the way, and we'll talk about a couple of fun things before we get underway with the rest of the topic. Certainly, I'd like to say hi also to some folks who are here. Cindy King out of Texas saying, good, very, very windy afternoon. A little windy here, not as bad as probably as with you in Texas. Happy to have you in. Frank Dunn from over in the UK, awesome, and also nominated for a Reggie Award, but we'll talk about that in a second. Maureen says, congrats. If I need to check the replay, if I can't make it in, hey guys, if you're here, no matter when you are tuning in, we're happy to have you here and happy to have you ask questions in the comments. Tune in for the replay if you can. Whenever you can't catch it whenever. That's why we do these things recorded, so you can catch them whenever you get a chance. You can listen to them while you're working. That is awesome. And also, I like to do this with things that I'm getting some education from. Listen to it again later and kind of absorb those tips and tricks a little better once you get to it. But that's the thing. Absolutely happy to talk to you about that. And everybody who's checking in on the replay, happy that you are here too. I do love for you guys to show up live. It's Friday, 2:30 p.m. Mountain Time. That's when we do it live because I like to interact and I let you derail me with questions all the time. So if you ever wanted a consultant, sometimes you get a little free consulting by tuning in on time. And Frank Dunn says, Global Underlay, we will get there. You're jumping ahead of the schedule, my man. You already know what's going on. Lyndon says, good afternoon, watching from North Carolina. Happy to have you in, Lyndon. Good afternoon to you. Sneeze says, I've done lots and lots of towels. I've never done knockdown stitches. I always use a topping. I guess I need to learn to do knockdown. Congratulations again, Erich. Before I go any further, I'm going to tell you why everybody's giving me congratulations. If you are not somebody who watches the same channels that I am on or isn't part of the rest of the kind of podcast world I'm in, you guys may not know that I am also the producer of a podcast. I'm not one of the hosts. I came on later as a producer, but they have an awards show. And this podcast is called the Two Regular Guys Podcast. If you don't know about it, now you do. Two Regular Guys Podcast is a really great podcast about all manners of things in the decoration industry, the apparel decoration industry. So you get screen print, sublimation, everything else. If you're a new listener, I'd love for you to go check them out at tworegularguys.com. That's the number 2, regularguys.com. Check them out. And the thing is, this morning they had their Reggie Awards. Every year there are user nominated awards. They are listener nominated. They're done by people in the industry, not by any boards, not by, it's not a magazine. It's not a corporate board. It's not any of that. It is people writing in, recommending people, nominating people for awards, and then voting. So it is all for the people, by the people. That's how we do it, Two Regular Guys. And the great thing was, didn't really want to say I campaigned for it or anything. I did a little campaign to tell people, hey, I'm up there. Was nominated myself for a few awards. And today I'm very proud to say I was awarded Best Ambassador for the industry. So I really love that. It's actually an award I've won before from the Reggies 4 years ago. The inaugural version of that award I also won, and I won that this morning. And I'd say a good portion of that is due to the time we have every week. So thank you all for being here, for learning, for interacting. For all of you who voted, thank you very much for voting. I am absolutely touched by being given this award. And frankly, I like to think that I do try and put myself out there, put my best foot forward, because as I said this morning, and as I always say, through embroidery, we are allowed to express ourselves, literally wear, and not literally, we literally wear our figurative heart on our sleeves by showing to whom we are affiliated, to whom we belong, what we believe in on our apparel, on our accessories, through our embroidery. We express ourselves through our craft, through our art, and we help other people express themselves, show their affiliations, and make a living. And there's nothing better than doing that in a creative, artistic way, in a way that supports everyone. So thank you all for voting for me, and thank you for recognizing the work that I have done. I believe I've put in some good work, and hopefully it's been helpful for you. But I can't, like I said, Best Ambassador for the industry is the top award. I've won bigger awards. I've won magazine digitizing awards. I've won several awards in my career. I put myself out there and won some stuff. But having this voted on by people in the industry who care and who nominated me without being told to or asked to means a lot. So thank you all. And I can't I can't wait to keep doing it with you. So let's just keep on talking about embroidery as we do. Embroidery every day, embroidery always, because I think it is really a great way to express ourselves and to be able to, like I said, wear our hearts on our sleeves, to really show who we are, what we care about, who we love, what we belong to. and to wear that around with us in a physical way as we make these heirlooms that people care about and that carry them through. It means a lot, and it means a lot to be a part of that. So with that, folks, that's going on. If I'll go ahead and throw that up there, that is one of the things that is on that links list. If you want to see it, there actually is the full announcement. You're also going to find other people you know from the interaction in the lives. The guys from the Embroidery Nerd among them, people from Applicate Getaways. We had Lindsay and Christine on there. Lots of people were on there in on that YouTube link. If you want to watch the awards show, there was also cool stuff that came out of that in an educational front because each one of these winners went on to say not only what the award meant to them that they won, but to give tips for the next year of what they would do to help their business, to help their craft. So it's a cool thing. Check that out. It's the first link on the links list, and you can see the live, essentially the live stuff that we did. I was producing that, so in the back end, I'm jumping around, getting all these cameras ready, getting people on, and it was pretty cool. But I have to admit, if I'm a little scattered today, it's because all of last night was contacting and getting people together as the producer of this show, of the Two Real Guys show, to get them on onto the on camera tomorrow, to have them in the morning ready to go, to get their equipment ready. And then this morning was managing all of them while we did the show. And so I've been a little bit scattered, but hopefully it won't be too scattered to teach you something good about textured substrates and fabrics like we're going to talk about today. So that's on there if you want to check it out. So that's what people are mentioning. I'll go ahead and jump to a couple more people and talk about it. By the way, Cindy, as you said, you did a lot of stuff without knockdown. I'm going to say here, without going too far into it before we get into the rest of the show, this is why I like knockdown. And I'll just say it ahead of time. Knockdown, or whatever kind of stitching you're talking about, it's also why I use different kinds of underlayment to raise things out of piles or deal with texture. That underlayment, the knockdown, is going to last as long as the thread that is being used for the design. Toppings, even the ones that are not meant to wash away, that you tear away, but especially the ones that wash away, are by their very nature temporary. And the loops in the towels, especially when you have heavy toweling, when you have stuff that has faux fur, the loops, the fibers, the hairs can eventually work their way through your design, depending on what the design is. If it's a loose design, open design, especially something with wide satin stitches, you will see splits later on down the road. You can see those loops work their way back out through the design. May not be entirely permanent. You might be able to fluff it back down and move those stitches back over the top. But for my money, I like using either a knockdown, which is the kind of global version of it that we talked about earlier that we'll get into, or local underlay, heavier underlays that knock things down and hold things down underneath, say, satin stitch columns, because the thread that's in that underlay is the same thread that's on top. It'll last as long and wear as well as the thread in the design, and it holds it down forever. So that's my thing. Can we still use toppings? I think we can, and we probably should. With some toweling, that's probably all we need is to use toppings and lift the stitches over the top, and it's fine. On extremely heavy toweling, on stuff that has really long loops or fibers or hairs, I tend to like to use something permanent because those toppers are temporary. So that's what I'm saying. Is even when you use like a plastic topping, people use a plastic film topping that rips away and it stays there. Or if you're seeing somebody using just materials that they have around them, they'll use something like a shopping bag, a Ziploc bag, whatever they have, and then tear it around the outside edge of it. I have seen down the road where those plastic toppings start to fail when they're washed and dried, and when these things are often on things like toweling that is definitely going to get washed a lot. And certainly could be washed hard. It could be washed with a fair amount of chemical or heat. Those plastics tend to break down, and once they crack, sometimes those loops hop up. Not all the time, but I'm exceedingly cautious, and for me, the quality is worth the stitch count. And that's just me. But like I said, that's one of those things I like. I like for everybody to get a chance to check out. In any case, let me go and say hi to a few more people before I get done here. Marianne says, good afternoon out in Santa Fe. Happy to have you in as well. Yosta's in from Sweden. Hi, Yosta. Happy to have you in. And you said, you're the best. You're the best too, man. You send me awesome stuff and fun jokes that we get to share on the show. Thank you very much for engaging and being everywhere that you are. Everybody in this comment section is awesome. You guys are all superstars. Seriously, we don't do this without you, and I don't do this unless you're here. Love to have you guys here. I do love being here. I do love teaching, and I will do videos without without an audience, but I don't have that kind of energy without you guys here, and I really love the interactions. And by the way, Jeff is on, another winner, one of the best guests with Three Layer Guys. Another Reggie winner. Jeff and Adam both on. Adam was a runner-up, a very, very strong second for up and comer, and he did great. Young man just starting out in the industry and previous to any possibility of working. This is someone who is like 10 years old. this is awesome that you got that close, man. And really, people took years to get where they are, and you were very close to them and winning that award because of your energy and your work. So thank you, Adam, for being on. If you haven't seen bjjhats.com, that's Adam's company. Joe Reed is watching from work. Thank you for watching and listening in. And you are awesome, doing great work. Frank says, well deserved. Thank you, Frank. I sure hope so. I will certainly try and make it worthwhile. Jenny on the UK says, good evening. Good evening to you. And then Cindy says, "You better teach me how to do knockdown." I will today. If go get that links list. Don't drop those out. Those actually have all the settings that I use if you do it manually in your software, or if you have in Brilliant software. If you have Enthusiast, you can do automated knockdown, which I'm also going to show you. And Robin says, "Congratulations, thank you very much, Robin." Thank you to everybody. So with that, let's get out of the introductions, all that fun stuff. Yes, we already had a little bit of education, but we're going to get into the real meat of the thing. So, what are we talking about here? Well, we all know, as I said previously, as we get into the holidays, there's always going to be these types of materials. That's why I called this show Fuzzy, Furry, Quilted, Knit, and Ribbed. Because as you can see from the things that are on screen, this, at least for me, represents a lot of what I get during the holidays, during the winter. Toweling, because we have a lot of gift sets and monogramming and things like that. So I get heavy towels and plush towels that are often given for gifts. Robes are often in this category. And I'm going to throw in Sherpa blankets, Sherpa and Minky blankets. You would think because I did commercial work almost entirely and not a lot of other work that I would not have done those, but Sherpa blankets, Sherpa jackets, and things of that nature, and especially polar fleece, which is a lot lower pile, but still has a lot of texture to it, was something I did pretty frequently. Also on the right hand side, you're seeing knit hats. Absolutely tons of knit hats were being done consistently. And down there, you're also seeing quilted jackets, puffer jackets, and quilted jackets fairly frequently, not as frequently as the rest, but certainly something I did a lot of. And just barely down there behind the word knit, what you're seeing is the top of a stocking with fur. These are the kinds of things that I often did toward the holidays because either you're doing outerwear or something that is more maybe corporate for business that does have fur or texture, or it's a knit or it's a sweater knit, whatever it is. Lots of the knit hats, especially, that's a staple. Or even if you're doing like craft work, and hey, even in the commercial world, I did stockings every year because anytime you have a relationship with people in the industry that are in your community who know that you're in the industry of embroidery, they're going to bring you things, even if it's not necessarily your wheelhouse. And if they're good customers, well, even a large shop will probably take on things like stockings, like monogramming, like robes, like gifts. And certainly when times are thin, big shops will do that stuff too. They don't always tell you that. For me, the symbiotic relationship between small shops and big shops, where I usually put that, and I would send that to single head shops who are really good at personalization, but I usually did the digitizing, did a lot of work on them. But the rest of it, the knit hats, and honestly, the quilted jackets, and definitely polar fleece and Sherpa stuff, I did tons of it. And honestly, because I got into gift packages, merch, and doing things like corporate identity stuff. So company stores that had corporate identity gear and perks for workers, perks for employees. It meant I did a lot of that stuff in a corporate way. So it's like, yes, you might not think I would do baby blankets and things like that, but when they became part of a corporate package or when they became part of gifting to employees, then suddenly all of the guys who say, yeah, all I do is the staple corporate work, business to business everyday uniforms, suddenly are in the business of making blankets. And I was certainly one of those people as well. In my very early career, not so much. Later on, absolutely, we embroidered everything. So those kind of materials are just what we are forced to deal with. One way or another, one way or another, you will be handling something that has a lot of texture. So this is what we're going to talk about today, the different kinds of fabrics and what we have to do to deal with them, and a little bit about the constructions. Because like I said, quilted jacket is not about the fabric. The shells on those are great and smooth. It's the construction of the jacket that's a problem. It's also the thickness of the padding, the batting or whatever is inside of it. The other problems we have are, like I said, textural. So we have that. We have texture and stability. So that's really what we're dealing with. When we're on to toweling and robes and Sherpa and everything like that, and including knits and things that are ribbed and corduroys, anything like that. Basket weave polo shirts can even be in this category to some degree. Things that have a certain amount of texture and tooth to them, but definitely things that have extreme texture and nap or high pile, like the fleeces, like the Sherpas, like the things that have fibers and loops. Texture is the thing we're dealing with and we have to mitigate. The other portion we have is in the other side of it most of the time. And that's where we have quilted jackets, puffer jackets, and blankets often because they're multi layer. And that is stability, trying to get things stable and aligned in the hoop so that we don't have a lot of excess shifting. And especially if we are embroidering through multiple layers, which we often are in these cases, Um, Stability is even more important because we can cause misalignment that makes jackets not fit correctly, believe it or not, or makes a blanket not lay correctly once it's stitched. So we have the stability problem and we have the texture problem. And also in the stability problem, if we don't have things stably hooped, we also have the same problems we would have with any other sort of unstable material. And I'd say quilted material is very prone to the same kinds of problems, funny enough, that you sometimes get with athletic wear, that you sometimes get with performance wear, wherein the stresses of the embroidery itself, the stress of the design running, can cause shifting, can cause movement, bunching, things like that, because we're running on these disparate layers that slide past each other. So these are the two things we have to deal with. We have to deal with texture and we have to deal with stability. And those are really the chief problems, no matter what we're talking about. It'd be easier for me to say, this is how you stitch towels. This is how you stitch Sherpa. The truth of the matter is, all of this is together and we can break it down that way. Toweling, Sherpa, anything like that, including I would say knits, because I use the same knockdown stitching on knit hats because I think it really certainly helps out with stability and with definitely with the texture. Knits have a super deep ribbed texture. Those things can all go there. And when we're talking about stability, all of the quilted stuff and to a degree, even the knits can be dealt with in a way that creates more stability. So let's talk about that. The first thing everybody is concerned about certainly is stitching down nap, right? We're talking about stitching down nap. So that's the thing. We have tacking down nap or stitching down the nap or the pile, and then bridging gaps. When we're talking about texture, these are kind of the two things that cause the most problem. If we have something like a ribbed knit and we have vertical stitching of any kind, you're going to find that the gaps are a problem. And this can be also corduroys. Anything that has a vertical stitch angle, it has a tendency to want to fall in between those ribs. If these are the ribs, well, our stitches are falling down in between these ribs as we run them. And that's something I showed you with that t-shirt sample. So we often have to do things to try and either bridge gaps or avoid what I actually call issues with the angle of interaction. And I'll discuss that again in a moment. But the rest of it is dealing with nap, which is the thickness and the loops and what have you that are on the surface of the fabric. And like Frank said earlier, what I usually discuss in this is something that people might call a global underlay. Brian Bailey and I, Creative Brilliance, have discussed that, and that's a term that we use for other things. So I'm going to talk about that again in a moment in another context. But in this context, what Frank was saying and what I'm saying here, global underlay, just in this context, just means that it's an underlayment that's under everything. But really, for this purpose, for the purpose of dealing with toweling and nap and stuff like that, I'm just going to use the Embrilliance term for it. It is the term we all know and love, but it's something we know pretty well. It's knockdown stitch. We're going to talk about it in terms of the knockdown stitch because this is what it's doing. It actually defines itself. It's knocking down the pile, the fur, the loops, whatever it is that's on the top. And the thing is, knockdown stitch doesn't just knock those things down, it also provides a base. And certainly we can just discuss the knockdown stitch briefly. I'm just going to show you some examples as well, just to show you kind of how I handle the knockdown stitch. You see that I'm doing this taming texture article here. I'm actually going to jump out to some examples and we'll pop over to these. This is one of the ones that you saw in the earlier channel cap. In the thumbnail, you saw this piece. And this is a piece I did originally for a design collection. This one has monograms added to it, but it's a French book plate. I believe from the 1800s. I always called it the French cartouche. It's not really a cartouche, but it is like it's a little book plate that has a nice kind of flowy acanthus style embroidery. And what you're going to notice, this is a very, very plush high pile towel, and I've used a bidirectional underlay underneath it. You can't see it very well here. I actually used a spun polyester thread, so it doesn't have too much shine. It has a little more than I would have liked, but something that is matte finish will help with that. And in this case, what we essentially have are two fill stitches that are loose in density, very light in density, one at 45 degrees and one at 135 degrees. The reason I bring this up and show this to you is just to let you know this is what I mean by a knockdown stitch. And in my case, the classic knockdown for me, I used to call it a light mesh fill because before I was working with Embrilliance, their knockdown was different. And this is where we kind of get into the one question I keep getting about knockdown. Certainly everybody asks, and we'll talk about this. Do you use toppings? I don't with knockdown because usually I find knockdown stitching when the settings are right, and we have those settings in my articles. When those settings are right, doesn't usually need them. But the reason I'm showing you this particular piece here and why I'm discussing the two different kinds of underlay that I'm going to discuss is that I actually have these very fine details that you can see that are laying on top of this knocked down pile. This is fine 2 rows of straight stitching in 40 weight thread, dark on light. This dark on light is still going to be a little forgiving of shadows, but you see that I have very fine detail because this is a small piece. This is not a very large piece. These are very fine straight stitch details that are placed there on, over this knockdown. Well, here's the thing. What everybody asks me about knockdown are it really has to do with the two types that are available, the two that are usually common. And this is what they I'm calling them here, and what we often call them is unidirectional knockdown versus bidirectional. And I'm actually going to bring up software so I can show you some things and we can discuss this, right? So because I'm in Brilliance here, I can actually just use some automated knockdown to help you. This is the original piece you're seeing here. And actually, I'll run you through it. This is what a bidirectional knockdown looks like digitized. And essentially, this can be done with any fill stitch tool. You can see that I have an initial outline underneath it. And then I'm starting from that top left corner down to the bottom right. It actually does go up to the center. I would actually travel along the edge depending on this one. I didn't mind it doing this because I'm going to cover it with the second run. There's not another edge run, but then it comes back across. And as you can see, that was the original, and it didn't have quite the right pathing, but that's what it is. It's essentially 2 light fills. That's really all this is for the bidirectional knockdown. And then you see I'm stitching all of my details on top, what have you. And then there's the multiple satin stitches that make up this very acanthus-like kind of foliated sort of design style. So that's the actual style of the design. You saw the original real thing. But let's just bring this cartouche in without anything else. Let's bring the frame in and we'll talk about the two kinds of knockdown. Now, like I said, if you're in your own software that doesn't have any automation, you can easily do this by drawing a contoured outline around your piece or making a contoured outline, depending on the tools you have. It will either create an outline or a contour, or you can draw one yourself. And then you're creating two different, two tatami fills, and really it's just loose densities, and the densities can be variable. You can decide on how much density you need to cover up, to cover that kind of material, to see exactly how you want to set it up. It really depends. There's some stuff that has really fine fibers. I found I actually had one time that I used it on, believe it or not, a neoprene. You wouldn't believe it, but it had incredibly fine fibers. It was fuzzy, but it was poking through all the embroidery, and I used this to knock it down, but I had to go pretty dense on it to make it work. That one was really a dance between how much was stretching the fabric and how much was knocking down the fibers. However, you can work with this density. The thing is, I'm just letting you know it's much less than a full fill. We are not at a full fill rating whatsoever. We'll talk about the numbers in a second. But here's the thing. If you're using your own, you can just create those 2 fills on a contour that's maybe 1 to 3 millimeters outside the outside edge of your design. You make that expanded contour. Your start point, left bottom up to the right top, and then right top down to the right bottom. And when you do that, you're going to travel across and then you're going to fill back down and you're going to get that mesh like setup. Some people do this with motif fills and other things and cross stitch. For my money, I don't love that because they don't make continuous lines of stitching. You may see the crosses in the cross stitch come apart. If you have a really heavy Sherpa, you'll see that those crosses, when they just draw the cross individually each time, the tips of each cross stitch cross don't always hang together and they pull apart and then they're not as stable. This is incredibly stable because we have a full fill all to one direction. It's one filament of thread unbroken. And when you come across the other direction, it's one filament of thread unbroken. The only difference here is that you can see which one is on top and which one is on the bottom. There is some texture there. And if your thread is shiny, it may stand out, especially if it's on a matte finish object like a towel. But in this case, like I said, it really is just 2 fills. That's what it's built out of. This one was built manually in a different software. So, and this one, like I said, the pathing is not great on this one. It's a really old piece of mine, but one direction and then the other direction again. And this one went from the bottom to the top. That's still fine. As you can see, 1 tatami fill, 2 tatami fills. That's all it is. Really not a big deal, but it makes a lovely mesh that essentially has a little bit of something at any angle to hold things up. And that's where we're going to get into the detail between the two kinds. So let's talk about this again. We have unidirectional versus bidirectional knockdown. So if I'm in Brilliance, we actually have this as an automated thing where I can say add knockdown stitching. And in this case, I'll turn off bidirectional here. You see that the density is 1.2 mils, stitch length is 4 mils, and the inflation on this is 5 millimeters. Has a pretty good inflation. Like I said 1 to 3 for some people. They like to go real tight. 5 is great. I like the debossed look, but this is the default at 5. I'm going to leave it at 5 so we can see it. And we'll take it off of bidirectional. Now it's unidirectional. And what you're going to see about this particular one, pardon me, is that it actually is one direction. It only goes in one angle. So we have that pretty much at a 45. Does this work? Absolutely, this works. And some people prefer the texture of the unidirectional fill. Pardon me, while I grab a drink real quick. Some people really love the unidirectional fill. It can be a little smoother. It doesn't look quite as bumpy, perhaps, on extreme pile as you might see, or on smooth but thick pile materials. You might not see as many bumps. Um, and so some people really do like the unidirectional fill or the unidirectional knockdown. For me, I tend to like the bidirectional. And here's kind of the reason why. If we get down and zoom into this thing a little bit deeper, you may see that yes, we're on that one direction here. We have that 45 degree. And as long as nothing in our details is causing us any trouble, that's all right. But then you'll occasionally hit something like this stitch here. And I'm going to go ahead and see if I can turn on pointer focus so you can see what I'm talking about. But if we're looking at the stitches that we have here, here's my pointer as we can see it. Every once in a while, you'll have stitches or lines of stitches that fall really right between the two lines of stitching, or they exactly line up. And you'll see a lot of stitches in this particular piece are lining up right on that 45-degree angle. Well, what can happen, doesn't always happen, but what can happen with really fine stitching, like some of the stuff I have here, and you'll see that throughout this piece, there are stitches that line up right on the 45 or very close to it. These stitches right here can fall into the knockdown. And when they do, the knockdown can raise up higher than those stitches and they can obscure the stitches, or the stitches can sink in and they might look like they're gone. They might disappear. They might just be less prominent. And so you might have an uneven look. And if you see some of these passes here, it's actually quite a lot. You might have like a large string of pieces here that have that same look where they're going to run right underneath it. You'll have a 3 or 4 stitches all that run really close to that angle and don't sit on top of the rest of the stitching that's there. So when you have that with that unidirectional knockdown, like I said, it's not that something that's going to happen all the time, but when you have fine detail like I have here, you want it to be able to sit up on the top. The other thing that you can occasionally have happen is on the unidirectional knockdown, and like I said, depending on your material and how it lays those loops down, it may not do this, but you can also have issues with that happening on a turning satin, where as we turn through all the angles of turning satin, sorry for moving around a lot here, we can eventually end up where some of our satin stitches also line up on that same 45. And when they hit the 45 degree, they may want to sink in and pull in a little bit. We might get a little bit of sawtoothing or a poor edge quality. Like I said, these are extreme cases, but it does happen. And especially when we're dealing with things like ribs or the heavy knit hats, where we've got an extreme vertical ridge, where we have those deep dives in between the ribs. So we've got valleys and ribs. When we don't have something that goes across those at any given angle, that mesh really holds up on top of that. Then anything vertical that accidentally lands on that doesn't have something underneath it. I mean, with these all at 45 would probably be fine, but depending on how you turn those, if you make yours manually, you can have things fall in and it's not as stable. Also, the directional stuff, just like a directional knit garment, might stretch a little bit differently in either direction depending on if you're using a stabilizer that holds up or not. It really depends. But for me, the big deal is fine detail. Like I showed right in this piece here, and you can see circled here, these stitches can fall into the knockdown at times. So for that reason, because I did a lot of straight stitch work or fine detail work, small lettering on top of heavy knits, something that I did a lot with seals and other detailed pieces and small lettering for corporate logos. I was I'm pretty careful about that stuff, and I want to make sure something is bomb proof. For me, the bidirectional knockdown made more sense, and because, like I said, if we pop out here and let's just take that knockdown back off, let's go back up to the utility menu here, and we go ahead and say add knockdown stitching. We're going to reset our defaults here. We're going to throw it down to bidirectional instead. So let's say we have our bidirectional knockdown. Now, as you see, almost any place we land, no matter what angle we're hitting at, almost every stitch lands on 1 to 2 rows. And especially, I might tighten this up just a little bit. This is at a 2 millimeter density. I'd probably go 1.8 if I were setting this up myself. Um, Anytime that we have a stitch, it's very likely to land on one of those diamonds in that background mesh, to land on 2 threads at least of that background and not fall through. So if we have that diamond here, no matter what angle our stitch is, it's really likely to land on those pieces and be held up by the knockdown. So that is kind of the burning question. Whenever I talk about knockdown stitch, people will ask me, how do I build mine? I build those, like I said, if I build my own light mesh fill, it's what I used to call it previous to working in the software. That light mesh fill, it is a mesh. It is done with that 45 and 135-degree tatami fills. And I do that specifically to have a stitch in almost any direction be able to land on top of that mesh. And it's like a chain link fence. Any direction you hit, there's something there underneath it generally, and you're not usually going to have any stitches that are smaller than that gap between them. Like I said, 1.8 or so, you're going to end up with at that density, you get a stitch every 0.9 mils. The likelihood of any stitch being smaller than a millimeter that's important to you is not very likely. They're going to hold up on top of this sort of piece. So that's why I use bidirectional fills for that, or a bidirectional knockdown, and or why I use two separate tatami fills at angles opposed to each other, is to give you that additional stability. And it also gives you stability to the entire design. So that's that. When we're talking about that stuff, when you hear somebody say global underlay, there are multiple things that we're going to talk about with that. There is another kind of underlay, an interior underlay that I'm going to discuss. But when they talk about knockdown, that's what we're talking about. Certainly, you can do the unidirectional knockdown, nothing wrong with it. And in some ways, like I said, it is a little bit smoother. It has a little bit less texture to it. And on some fabrics, if you're just trying to do some small amount of knockdown to hold things down, but you don't want to have that look of the grid, you don't want to hold things down quite as much, maybe that then you use that kind of unidirectional. Lots of people like it. It was the standard for a very long time. But after some campaigning from me, and Brilliance now also has the bidirectional knockdown as one of its automated settings, because I spent a lot of time in my career building them manually out of two fills. And if you go ahead and look at those articles that I put up in the links list, it will tell you exactly, no matter what software you have, how to build them out of two fills, because there's no problem with that. You just need a contour that goes out from the edge of your piece, and you make that same contour into two different fills with those same light settings with the opposed angles. That's all you have to do. And honestly, what I can say very reliably on this is that this has saved my bacon quite a few times. It has enabled me to use designs that are not optimized for knit, that are not optimized for toweling directly on the toweling. Using something like this, especially the bidirectional knockdown, I have been able to take a standard logo that was meant for, literally for polo shirts, for active wear, drop that on top of a heavy towel on top of fleece, as long as I've put this knockdown stitch first. And when I do this at those settings that are in my articles, I have not had to use any sort of water soluble topping or any sort of plastic topping or any other kind of mesh topping to hold it up. This builds a mesh that works, and it doesn't really add a tremendous number of stitches in this piece. If I just back this off and take the pardon me. If I just take that off so you don't have that anymore, we had 5733 as the stitch count on this piece. We add it back in 7905. Sounds like a lot. We've got some stitches there. It's not a tiny amount of stitches, but the amount of stitches in comparison to the amount of work you would do removing topping and the quality limitations you would have, if I put this design with all of these little tiny tendrils of straight stitch directly on top of a really high pile towel, chances are you would see some loss in detail and those things would get swallowed up. So, like I said, you can do this in any software. You can do this by multiple methods. Personally, for my money, no matter which method you're going to use, I like to use the complete tatami fill rather than the motif fills. The motif fills can work, they do work. Though I find that sometimes they'll separate or spread apart depending on sequencing and on the material. And I do personally, and this is a personal choice as per the usual, personal choice for me is to use a bidirectional fill. It's just the way that I like. The bidirectional knockdown is my personal choice, but I'm not saying you can't do something different. Like I said, some people don't love the super debossed knocked down look where it does look like we've embossed that area out of it. And some people don't love that it can be, depending on tensions in fabric, can be a little bit bumpier looking or a little more textured looking than the single pass. But the single pass also has a little bit generally higher densities that you might run it at. Whereas I have found that I can get lower densities and lower stitch counts from the bidirectional mesh fill, this bidirectional knockdown, than I can using a single direction knockdown fill underneath things. Like I said, though, it doesn't have to be super complicated, but if that's the question, that is why at least I choose the different things. And it can also be up to the particular design or the particular item that I'm working on. If I were to show you some other examples, certainly we can show you this again. This is that cartouche fill, and that's got the bidirectional, as you saw, with a nice spun polyester threads. That's something that's not very shiny. It looks great on toweling because Though you can see a little bit of shine here. I was using a hot light to try and make sure you could see it. When you didn't have the hot light on this thing, when I wasn't really trying to show you the thread, it faded right away. You didn't really see that knockdown much at all. And with matte finish threads like a matte polyester, or with something like a spun polyester thread that has a little bit of fuzz to it, it really is not as visible as it is here. But the thing is, depends on the design. Something like this is a fully filled design. This is something I did for a company called Rue Materials. It was on a nice heavy toque, a nice heavy knit cap. And the truth of the matter is, it's a full fill. Am I going to use knockdown on this? No. I might use a bidirectional tatami underlay, especially in the white. So am I using knockdown? Maybe yes, maybe no. I'm using an automated underlay that is very much like a knockdown to hold down that nap, but I've got a full coverage here. I'm not going to have too much trouble with it. In this case, the only thing I'm worried about is, like I said earlier, the angle of interaction. I'm probably not going to use a lot of vertical fills directly on this piece unless I do have a mesh underlay. Because once again, if I've got ribs and I use vertical fills, every line has a chance to fall in and spread the piece apart. Also, the natural push. We know pull and push compensation. Well, if I have a vertical fill, what does it want to do? It wants to pull top and bottom. It wants to push out to the sides. What is the weakest direction on a knit hat? It is to the sides because it stretches over your head. If you have your vertical fill pushing to one side, it is going to stretch that knit out and it's going to cause show through gaps and distortion. But it's still, you're not going to see me using a ton of knockdown on a fully filled design. Yes, there may be some internal underlay that's similar, but that's not where I'm really looking at it. That in that case, I'm more just looking to avoid a lot of vertical fills. And in this case, if you have the right underlay, even that's not necessarily a hard and fast rule. I just find it puts more stress on that material. The other possibilities we have is like this. I'm going to show you. This is a bad piece that was brought to me. A company called Res Riders. Res Riders, they brought me this beanie and it was done with no backing. It was just stitched in, well, not with no backing, with no global underlay, no knockdown stitching whatsoever. And in the course of stitching it and trying to put all the outlines on it, it looked terrible. It was done with a lot of thick outlines and heavy satin stitches, a lot of density, and the extra density was put into this piece in order to keep it from showing through the garment. However, I was able to knock all of that out. And this piece right here does not have any stitching in the black. You'll see that is just show through. So the black is not stitched in. That is all gap. And that is done with that same light mesh fill or bidirectional knockdown that I showed you before. And also the material in this, you see these threads a little more prominently. That's because they're just polyester. There is no, this is just like a standard poly embroidery thread that's used. Really light densities. And you can see how much better it's holding up on that knit hat. So same kind of thing. Even at an angle, we can kind of see more of it, but it holds it up and it also makes the entire area around the design stable. One of the other functions that global underlays and knockdown have is to stitch the garment down and stabilize it to the stabilizer we have inside. If we stitch down the entire area of the design we're working on to the stabilizer that is hooped underneath it, we stitch it down. Even if we've hooped the entire piece so we have it partially arrested, we stitch down the area of the design with knockdown, or I'm going to talk about this in a moment, with a global underlay that's a global tacking underlay. We hold that material in place so we avoid shifting and distortion. All these things are possible with that kind of global underlay. And like I said, this is all we're looking at. Just wanted to show you that one more time. Very simple. Start and end here, start and end here. On the first one, I like to put an edge run if I'm trying to get a very clean edge. Sometimes you don't want a super clean edge. You can actually even use jaggedness or feathering on the edges if you want to try and make it less of a clean edge. You don't want that embossed look, but if you do, I like to have an initial edge run on the underlay here, and then I don't use underlay on the second piece. And also, this is done depending on what software you're on. Is either travel edge on this piece if you're trying to have that clean edge. You can either travel edge or trapunto, depending on your software, to keep that edge really nice and clean. But when you layer them right on top of each other, you get this mesh, and the mesh does wonders. Same thing here with this Keller Williams piece. Nice heavy knit, thin satin stitch text on top of it, and it holds up beautifully and on all colors, all sorts of pieces. So here it is again, done at an extreme angle so you can see it. Like I said, one of the weaknesses is if you're using standard polyester, there's a little bit of shine. You may see at angles, you may see just a little bit of that shiny thread, easily counteracted by using a matte finish thread or using something like spun polyester where it does have a little bit of fuzz to it. So like I said, this is something that we talk about and I have talked about many times, but I think it's still valuable. the one question I didn't answer in previous pieces is unidirectional versus bidirectional, and now you kind of know what I'm going for. I'm gonna grab some comments here because we think we have some different comments from people saying what they do. So you never know. It just turns out. So let's see what we have here. Cindy says, "So should I say lazy and more work adding the knockdown?" Um, I don't think it's more work adding the knockdown. I think it's really easy depending on what you're doing. And like I said, if you have in Brilliance, it's 2 clicks, and in that case, it was 1,200, 1,500 stitches. Depends on what you're doing or how dense you're making it. I think it really depends on where you're doing more labor. If the labor is in taking off the topping and you don't need to have someone watching the machine like a hawk or completely bound up while they're running that knockdown, you're actually getting more back than you might think because you've got opportunity costs certainly of having more time spent on the machine, but there's a huge labor cost in steaming or otherwise taking off toppings. So if you don't need toppings, I find that getting rid of that stage actually saves you more time by far than you're saving by not having the knockdown stitching in. And like I said, I think it also keeps it very stable. If you have something like that piece I just showed, the Keller Williams piece, this piece that has loose lettering that's not connected, if you do these and you don't have, let's say you want to use a stabilizer that washes away or something else, or you don't have them connected, you use a tearaway. People sometimes like to do that. They'll pull on the design or they'll put it on someone's head and then the letters go cattywampus. I've talked about this before. They go all over the place. They go at different angles and it looks like they're spreading apart in a way that you might not want. The knockdown stitching is almost like a freestanding lace. It makes an object out of your design. It can also add stability to the design because we've made a bidirectional mesh that's all knit together. It can help. So it really depends. I find that it's useful. And in a big commercial shop, I was doing these all the time. I use knockdown on a lot of stuff. And also, this is the savior of the one item someone puts in a stack. When you do customer supplied, or even when you just have an order and they order a bunch of the standard jaggeds. Let's say I've got a bunch of soft shell jaggeds. This is actually how this order or this kind of order happens. Company comes in, they have a bunch of soft shell jaggeds. They have no texture. They're awesome to run, very easy to run, very smooth. They have a logo like this, really fine column stitching or small stitching. This isn't pretty big. This isn't really tiny lettering, but let's say they got little tiny lettering on that thing and they want 80 jackets, but 3 of the people want hats and they all want knit hats. Using the knockdown means that I don't have to do any other preparation to that design. I throw down the bidirectional knockdown and I sew those up, and those 3 hats run without any alteration to the top digitizing. If you're not a digitizer or don't digitize in house, using the bidirectional knockdown is super helpful in order to use your existing designs on other surfaces and substrates. It saves you. So it depends. Frank says, I only put topping under the design and not under the knockdowns. The topping is not trapped in the knockdown, making it hard to remove. That's a good way to do it too. Lift up the stitching. I mean, there's nothing wrong with using topping as well. I don't like it under the knockdown because it does make it hard to remove. And also, personally, I don't find that you often need it. But if you're finding that you're having issues with texture or your edges and you want to put it under there, yeah, great idea. Run your knockdown first, and then slap down your films. Slap down those films afterwards so you're not trying to pick them out from underneath the knockdown. The knockdown is there to specifically interact with the knits and interact with the material. You don't need it under the knockdown generally. And if you do, your knockdown may be a little bit too loose density. If loops are still popping up through your knockdown, you probably don't have a high enough density or it's not somehow interacting with that material or the angles in a way that doesn't work out for you. So it depends. Frank says you the double square setting in Wilcom. Yeah, there's like I said, depends. Depends on the setup. Like I said earlier, a lot of the people were coming to me saying they were using cross stitch. Cross stitch isn't the best because cross stitch has a tendency, like I said, to individually draw crosses. And sometimes the way it paths through the design with the crosses is that you'll have crosses next to each other, but the tips of these crosses were stitched separately. They're not connected. It didn't stitch across, that the 2 crosses just butt up together and you'll actually see them shift apart from each other and stuff come out. That is rarely how it goes, but sometimes it does. So for me, fill stitches have worked. And the reason I also teach is fill stitches is because I don't have to worry. Every software has some kind of tatami fill stitch setting. So I know if I teach it with fill stitches that it can be useful to everyone. But yeah, whatever setting you have that makes a mesh. The other thing that a lot of people do if they're not trying to do a bunch of extra setup on it, especially if they're not doing extra underlays or something and they only have one underlay on their system, is to make a fill and then use a fill underlay underneath it. The problem with that is they usually don't have the option to travel edges. And if you're trying to have that really clean kind of debossed edge, like I showed, some people like to either use travel edge or trapunto, however it's called, in order to do that. And if you use an automatic underlay to be your first layer, that automatic underlay will usually not have that, and you might get extra stitches across the area that you're knocking down, and they're often visible. So that's why I don't usually do that, but some people do that pretty frequently. So a couple people who are in there too. Ramona says, just getting here, bookkeeper on my computer. All right. Hey, you got to keep books. If you don't keep books, you can't keep open. Aaron says, hello. Hello, Aaron. Robin said, I think you had your default settings somewhere. Can you direct me to that article? Yes, in the links list. You'll find it in the comments already. I'll throw it up on the banners one more time for you guys. So linklist.app/PVE ZHD9 for everybody across the ocean or in Canada. So a PVE ZHD9, and yes, those are capital, the ZHD. You can also get that. It is in the comments. Click on that, and those articles, several of those articles actually show the default settings as part of what's in there. I believe the images article may even have them as well. So almost all of them have that setting. And honestly, you really don't need to have full densities on that. Go look at the articles. 1.8 is probably what I'm usually at, depending on a really heavy texture. I try and lighten them up. And frankly, I go as light as I can when I can because I don't like to add any extra density that I don't have to. But certainly check that out. That is what we've been doing in my world. Whenever I've been doing this stuff commercially, I've been using the bidirectional mesh, and it does certainly hold up. So check that out. And also, if you're using Embrilliance today and you use Enthusiast and just click bidirectional knockdown, it's really pretty close to my default settings. So you kind of have my default settings if you're an Embrilliance user who's got Enthusiast, or if you're not a digitizer and you buy Enthusiast to throw it under your digitized files. Um, the bidirectional setting by itself, pretty darn close to my usual defaults as it is. You might be able to just do a couple clicks and pretty much get the Erich bidirectional knockdown if you want it. It is there. Certainly, there are other people who do it, and this is also useful for embossing. And in fact, I can bring that up if you want to see that too. It's something that I've done on purpose for embossing, and it's something that is in some of my designs. I do have one design that I've got up on theonlystitch.com. You guys know I don't put a lot of stock designs up there, but usually that's something that I you put up designs so that people can learn from them. But I'll go ahead and throw that up there really quickly. Over on the Only Stitch, you'll see this embossed paw print embroidery design, and it's something I also mentioned in the last episode that I discussed this. Essentially, that same knockdown that we're using, the settings are very similar to what we do here in order to emboss this paw print. If we have a nice heavy toweling, it'll pop out through the open areas, and we do that on purpose. We allow it to pop out, but this debossed area in here, it's got the only thing that's different with this is I have this chain stitch and I'm using these borders. So I've got a faux chain stitch on the inside edges here, and then I have these satin borders to really call it out and make crisp edges. But this area here that's used in trapunto designs that are meant to knock down fleeces, knock down pile, that is also the same thing essentially in the settings as is being done with a bidirectional knockdown. You can see how we get that awesome little paw pad texture popping up through that design. So that's something that's over at theonlystitch.com. And that's one of my designs that's available for purchase. Certainly something I've done before on purpose because sometimes you may use this sort of material, not like I said, not only for managing texture, but for bringing it out. I've also done big pieces where I will knock down an area and allow letters to cut through, big logos and stuff like that. You usually want to use things that are large and have a lot of area. Little fine areas will not puff up as much as larger areas. Actually, and I'll bring that back up one more time. Even in this paw, you can see that the smaller areas of the toe pads are not as high or as fluffy as the larger open area. Same thing is going to happen with anything else you work on. You're going to trap a lot of the stuff around the edges, and a lot of those loops can lay down. So you only get the stuff that's truly in the clear and far away from your edges when you stitch that stuff out. So if you're trying to do it on purpose as a design element, the things that you want to cut out of that should be pretty large. And I don't think I need to give you like a guideline. What I'll say is I believe these are close to, 8 to 10 mils in here. That's probably a little too small. The paw pad is obviously a little bigger because we have that area in there, and it's sticking up higher. More of the loops are free to lift up. So hopefully that'll be helpful for you guys. But that's, like I said, that's another way we can use it. It's the same technique. So I'm never going to say like, this is the Erich knockdown. It's the one that I use, but it's not something that's totally brand new. It's not something that didn't happen before me. There were people who were doing this kind of design work before I was around. It is, however, something I found that in the commercial world, when I first came on, not a lot of people were doing it. And in fact, I didn't know anybody who had done it. I figured it out because of somebody having a design like this. When I first did it, the concept was from a design like this where I saw they were using an artistic embossing setting, and I used the piece based on one of these, seeing that, wow, that really made a nice smooth version. There was a really smooth material now that's been essentially carved out. Here's this towel that's really heavy and loopy, and all this area that's under the stitching is not that heavy. And I saw that and I'm like, well, it'd be really good with that. That'd be incredibly useful to hold down some knits. And in fact, if I go to the printwear article, the original article, this is my very first piece of knockdown that I ever did. It was for this company, Wells Fargo, and I'll actually bring this up on screen if I can get it to zoom in nicely. Hopefully, it'll. We'll see if I can get it to behave here. It was kind of not behaving earlier, but yeah, if I can get it to zoom in nicely, you'll see that essentially this was the first piece that I ever worked on. And it is not awesome, but this is the first bidirectional knockdown I did. And I got really tiny text. And this is a very small piece. I mean, we're looking at not even a couple inches. This is smaller than a hat piece. This is like 1.75 inches probably. And this piece, I had to make that work on this fleece. I couldn't figure out how to make these incredibly fine text work on the piece. It was for their center stage balloon, a hot air balloon that looked like a stagecoach. And that Wells Fargo piece was my very first knockdown. You're looking at it. And as you can see, I made a big square behind it like a jerk. I just didn't even try. I didn't do a contour. I didn't think about it. All I was doing is trying desperately to make their logo that I had made for all these fine garments and button up shirts work on fleece. And that's what did it. And in fact, the other thing that happened here, we have this piece for Knob Hill Bar and Grill down the road. That same technique worked very well on this French terry that was done for sweatbands. So these sweatbands had the same kind of problem. They looked awful, they weren't working very well, but we knocked that down. It was almost invisible using that very same technique. So that technique, like I said, I have lived with it for a long time. It's been very useful to me over the years. So I figured I would share it with you and just show you what was going on with that. And that's why I use the bidirectional. Like I said, the fine detail is really why I use it. But there are other reasons you might choose unidirectional knockdown. Really is dependent on what your design is. And I suggest with everybody, test what works for you and see what you like better. Like I said, texture, smoothness may be part of that. So with that, let's go briefly. Like I said, we've gone pretty heavily into the knockdown. Let's go briefly into essentially the quilted, the puffer coat, stuff like that. Let's go briefly into stability and talk a little bit about that. When we're dealing with things like puffer coats, quilted jackets, quilted materials, and I actually have some stuff here next to me within grasp. I have a piece that I did for the folks at Netflix. You can see the Netflix logo is on the back of that, and it's kind of puffy, fairly puffy, not incredibly puffy, but there's the Netflix logo that's on the back of that one for Netflix Studios. Pardon me, folks. And then here's the Chambers logo that was done on that piece as well, and that's the front logo that I did for it, and it's on a puffer. That's the one that's actually on the title card as well. And the thing that we have in problems with this stuff generally, yes, there can be some problems with thickness, but we also have problems with stability. Stability is really the biggest issue I've run into. And the funny thing is, one of the other places I've run into stability issues the most would have to be on blankets. I've done lots of blankets that have multiple layers and they're only bound at the edges if they are not a quilted blanket. We now have these two layers that like to roll off of each other and slide past each other and not stay together. So there are a few things we have to do. We want to keep those two layers together. And why is that? Well, a couple different reasons. Certainly, when we have a blanket, people will be sewing blanket corners that have those two layers that slip apart from each other. And if you don't align the two layers and keep them very flat before you hoop, no matter how you're hooping, you can find if you misalign them, then as that seam pulls up, the corners will go up or down, or they'll be slipped off, or there'll be a lot of curling or puckering once you try and put the blanket back into its original state or fold it up for presentation. So that stability can be an issue. Also with things like puffer coats, we can end up where you can literally have things not fit very well, or you can have the lining be off-centered or somehow otherwise out of sync with that outer shell. So that's part of the thing that happens with stability. The other thing is there are sometimes issues with the puffiness itself. But I find with most of those, honestly, if I'm careful about my hooping and if I'm using some underlay, and we'll talk about that in a second, most of the time that puffiness has not been my major problem. The puffiness has not been my major problem so long as I'm taking care of those layers And so long as I'm making sure that things are firmly in order and that the layer is sitting right on top of the layer underneath it the way it's supposed to be in its relaxed state, nothing slid off from itself. As long as that's done, most of the time, the embroidery is by its nature going to tack itself down. However, if we don't have these things tacked together in a way that is useful, like I said, quilted stuff, and in fact, puffer coats are pretty well put together. They don't tend to cause too much trouble necessarily. But especially with those blankets that are two layers and slip apart from each other, I have found that sometimes as I start to stitch, they'll want to move apart from each other as I'm stitching, especially if I have a heavy design or design that has, some detail to it. And in that case, the stability is can be an issue. So, what are the kind of things we have to look out for that? Well, like I said, the shifting of layers is an issue. It can happen at multiple stages during the process. Either that shifting of layers can happen previous to hooping, or we can get some shifting as we're working on it, and it depends on how we hoop. Because those heavy jackets are often hard to get a standard hoop into without really crushing them down, I find that lots of people like to float them or use adhesive stabilizers to hold them on. However, when we do that, you have to realize if you float them in the hoop and you use an adhesive stabilizer, what ends up happening is you've only adhered the bottom layer or the inner layer of the jacket or the inner layer of whatever this garment is. Especially the puffers are really bad about this, and if they don't have really tight quilting on them, like fairly close together quilting, you have really large areas that are separated from each other, really wide gaps. Maybe they're every 4 inches. You can have that top layer be pretty free from the bottom layer. And when we only stick down the bottom layer to some adhesive, we end up having issues with that top layer moving around on us while we start to stitch. So that can be an issue. And like I said, the blankets are less so. The blankets, if you hoop them carefully, and like I said, make sure that those two corner layers, that seam is sitting flat, that they are laid down flat where they're supposed to be when you hoop, where that we absolutely had those layers parallel to each other and that the seam is lined up where it should be. We're not curling up, we're not curling down, we're not slide off to the side in any direction. If everything is tight like a tablecloth bottom and top and properly aligned, if we hoop it correctly, the material should be arrested in both directions or in all directions. Both the bottom layer and the top layer should be fine. The puffer jackets a little bit less because people don't always like to clamp those down. So shifting layers can be an issue. Now, certainly you have the right hoops that can make a difference for you. And that's something that I thought I would bring up is one of the videos that I have in those links is actually somebody using a magnetic hooping system. They're using mighty hoops to get those locked down. If you have those kinds of mighty hoops, then you're going to find you're going to have a better time of it because as you're doing this stuff, you can lock it down. The pressure of the magnets is going to make it enough to hold down, and you don't have to worry about trying to clamp thick material inside of a hoop ring. So you're already ahead of the game if you have something like the Mighty Hoop. This was a specific one from EDC Supplies, but whatever, it doesn't matter. If you go look at the video, you can just see that he's lining it up and he's dropping the Mighty Hoop on the piece. So magnetic hooping, as I say with magnetic hooping always, it has tension everywhere around the outside edge of that hoop, so we don't have any problems. And the tension is clamping force. It's clamping down through the layers. Generally, as long as you've got those strong magnetic hoops, you're going to be fine. It's going to arrest all that directional motion, all that warping, all that moving, as long as the inner layer and outer layer are lined up and you haven't shifted them off from each other. Something to check before you start running for sure. But that's the thing. The magnetic hoops can certainly help. So hooping can be part of how we make that how we make that work. So hooping can be part of it. Certainly, it is not the only thing that we can do, but magnetic hoops can certainly help. The other things we do are just to try and tie those two layers together, to try and tie the top layer and the bottom layer together, or the multiple layers together. People use many different ways to handle that. Some people go old school. They hoop it up or they float it up and then they pin outside of the area of the logo. They literally use sewing pins or curved pins and they pin the area around it so that we're just marrying the two layers together. That can certainly help. That is something that does work. I don't love using pins around the embroidery machine because I've seen so many people hit a pin with their needle, and you wouldn't think you could do it, but I've seen a lot of people do it. And then they've got needle shards floating around in their garment, especially on a puffy thing like that. It's not the best thing ever. So I don't love pinning if I don't have to. And for my money, tell you the truth, every time I pin everything fairly recently, I had to hem up a curtain, and I am not somebody who does a ton of construction stitching, and I stab myself with the pins repeatedly. I don't love pins. And especially if I'm handing off a bunch of garments to someone and I'm doing this commercially, the concept of pinning everything together sounds both like a tremendous amount of labor and like a lot of stuck fingers. So for my money, I don't like doing pinning very much. Can you do it? Absolutely. For one piece that's really cantankerous, won't hold together, have I ever pinned stuff? Absolutely, I have. As a digitizer, especially, I know exactly where the outside edges of that logo are, and I'm never going to hit that pin. I'm pretty close to it, and unless I'm making a big mistake, I'm going to be fine. And I think most of you would probably be fine too, but it's not my favorite method. Still, all we're trying to do is marry those two layers together. And so, what some people do to avoid that shifting is they certainly use basting stitches. Often, people will use on floating a basting box. Basting stitches are essentially where we use long stitches to sew through the garment. We usually do a box around the entire area of our logo, and we just stitch the two layers together. Only problem with basting stitches on some of these puffer coats is that these stitches can be hard to avoid seeing later. The holes that are left behind can be visible on, especially on really thin materials or materials that just have a very smooth surface. And even after steaming, sometimes they will still show some of those stitch points. They'll show some of that basting. So that can be an issue, but some people like to use a basting box around the design area. With something extremely puffy, the issue may be that unless you have that box pretty close to your design, there still can be some shifting inside the design. So we can see shifting during stitching because as we first start stitching, it's going to start clamping down material. It's going to start clamping down and shoving out of the way the stuffing that's inside, or at least smashing it down and sewing it together with our stitches. And the top layer can shift a bit. But the thing is, when I've got that kind of issue, what I'm sometimes looking to do is what I would do with performance wear, and that is to use what I sometimes would call like internal basting. And I'm putting that in quotes because that's not the term I use for most of the time. I usually say it's like a global tacking underlay. I'm going to bring in a couple slides from one of my articles that where I talked about this, or one of my classes where I talked about this. There's a couple different things that Underlay does. We talked about essentially, even though it was a global area instead of under each element, that Underlay supports top stitching. And certainly, if you go back to that other video where I talk about this stuff, I get deeper into Underlay for individual satin columns and individual objects. That is in the previous video in the links list. But the two functions of Underlay are supporting stitching. So supporting the top stitching defines edges, prevents show through. That's a conventional way. And then the other portion of working on this stuff is to essentially stabilize material. Like I said, we're stitching the material permanently to the stabilizer before you run the design. And when we're doing it internally, that means we're doing it under the design. So in this case, a global tacking or global attachment underlay is a straight stitch underlay that's shaped, meaning that it is underneath the shape of the design that we have at hand. And if we can, if the design is all connected, if it's not a bunch of free floating items, we actually can do it through the whole design and run from the center to the edges and back to the top stitching start point. And the thing is, we can do that with designs that are all connected. If your design is not all connected, then the best way other than this is to have what I would consider, instead of global underlay, we have an underlay that's under each element. Sometimes we can do this manually. So under each letter, we stitch down the entire letter. We use underlay under the whole letter, or we use branching to make the whole letter one object. And we let the underlay stitch down under the entire letter, the multiple columns that build that letter up before we stitch the top stitching, because then before we stitch any of that top satin or whatever stitching we have on top, we have already married that top material to the layer below it and to the stabilizer. So we're using it just like if I had taken a sewing machine and quilted that jacket down under the area of the design. So global attachment underlay is what I like to call it, but it is essentially, it can be this straight stitch underlay, but also if you're doing it letter by letter, it can be just having a branched letter that has all of the underlay in the letter run first before you run the rest of the underlay letter, or a special manual underlay you draw in that covers out to the extents of the letter. And we actually kind of show you what I'm talking about. A star underlay like this is something I've done with performance wear, but it can be done here too, where essentially I'm starting in the center and I'm stitching out to all these extents so that the entire area of this logo has some stitching underneath it to marry the layers together. That's one of those kinds of global tack down underlays. This is another shape underlay. In this case, this piece, I believe it started here, and I just ran along all the different elements and tracks that I had in here until I got back to my original starting point. And it is something that is invisible. It's a basting stitch we don't have to take back out. I can use shorter stitches so that I really tie things together strongly and pull them down, use the tension of those stitches to pull those layers together. And I can do this and leave it in place. I'm not taking it out. I'm not having holes left behind, and it does still have the added the added advantage of stitching everything together before I do the top stitching. So this is another way I do it. Global attachment underlay. Like I said, you can do the shaped underlay like this. It can also just be branching together each one of your letters if you have things that are separate. But when you have an item that's entirely put together, we have a logo that's entirely like this, entirely full together, depending on how much underlay you're doing on the logo itself. Like in this case, I'm not using a bunch of underlay under the fill itself, so I'm just using the star. However, you could also elect to do that as part of the underlay run. I still like to do this even when I'm using, say, a tatami underlay under a fill like this, because the tatami underlay may not center out. And if your material is really shifty, whether it's performance wear or the top layer of one of these puffers, I still like to kind of spread that material out and flatten it when I can. Though I do try not to be really overly heavy on the puffers. Certainly, the other thing you can do, and it's harder to do attachment stitching for this, you can maybe do heat press depending on the shell of your puffer jacket, is to use patches. And I think that's always an option for puffers as well. Patches look good on puffers too, because you don't get the sunken area of a big logo like this. But I just think that when we're dealing with any sort of shifting material, multiple layers, and we must sew through all the layers, one of the options we always have is to use our underlay to tack things together as a construction element. Because as we know, underlay does not just support top stitching, it is used to tack together to marry the material we're stitching on the garment itself to the stabilizer. And in this case, when we have multiple layers of material, it is used to marry all of the layers together and marry it to the stabilizer before we start running, so that everything stays dimensionally stable, doesn't stretch, doesn't move any more than we want it to. So that's really what we're talking about today. That was uh, when we're dealing with all this stuff. Like I said, I've had the same problem when we're dealing with blankets, multi-layer fuzzy blankets. And the funny thing with those, sometimes I can go ahead and just use my knockdown, because the knockdown is going to do the same thing. The knockdown stitch area is going to stitch together the blanket under the entire area of the logo. In this case, the only thing you might find is on a bidirectional knockdown, or a single directional knockdown, you may find some push in the direction of that first fill. I find that even if it does a little distortion in that direction of the first fill, because I do the bidirectional, it balances out by the two directions that I use. Once it stitches both angles, I have a tendency to be able to, especially if I go up one side, then down the other angle, I have balanced out all the different angular stresses that I'm trying to get done, so that I don't have a lot of shifting. And by the time I stitch my top stitch, I'm usually fine. Plus, depending on how big your contour outside of the edge of design is, a little bit of shifting, the small amount that usually happens during stitching if you're hooped, isn't the biggest problem that you have. But like I said, if you have a fuzzy item that also has multiple layers, using that knockdown can serve both needs. It can tack everything together and it can knock down all of that nap. All right, with that, folks, I think that is all the technical stuff we're going to cover. I'm going to go briefly through it again and just kind of let you know what we were talking about, and kind of bring it home. First thing, that links list, I'm going to put that up for a second. Again, in there, you are going to find all those different articles. You'll also find, like I said, you're going to find the two regular guys video, the video of the hooping going down, all of the articles that we had, and you're going to find some copies of other links that are important to the show. So that's all going to be there in the links list. If you want to check that out later, you can also find all of my settings if you're building this in whichever software. Like I said, if you're an enthusiast and in Brilliance, the default bidirectional stitching settings are close to my defaults. You can test those for yourself. Like I said, I always like to go less stitching if I can. So you might want to actually expand that density out, use larger numbers, use less density to make that coverage happen, but it's pretty close. So if you're wondering how it looks, check it out there and you can make some adjustments to your settings thusly. But all of my settings for those bidirectional, the kind of the mesh fill, the light mesh fill, the bidirectional knockdown, are in my articles, and you can check them out and build them with fills in any software you have if you need to. Like I said, texture, that's what we're dealing with. For texture, we're trying to bridge gaps, and that's another thing this does. It covers up the gaps. It keeps us from having those angular interactions where things fall into each other. But then we also have stability, and we handle that by getting things married to the stabilizer and by sewing the layers together and hooping carefully, and making sure once we're hooped that we're not shifting any more than we have to. Keep your layers aligned, get things tacked down. use your stitching to do more than just support your top stitching. Use it as a construction stitch as well, and use that internal tacking underlay. Use that internal attachment, that global attachment underlay, whenever you can with connected designs, because it really can help with materials that shift and materials that stretch to provide rippling. Work from the center out wherever you can. When you have unstable materials, it always helps us to keep from crashing our embroidery into itself. You stitch down an area and then move your embroidery toward it. You can create loops, you can create waves, you can create puckers and ripples. Work center out like a tablecloth. Stitch everything down with the underlay before you run your top stitching when you can. And you're going to have increased stability, and you're going to have a better time with these materials and with shifting layered items. Last couple things, in case you guys are interested, I am just signing contracts for 2022 events. We don't know how things are going down for sure yet, but things are going off so far. We are getting planned, things are getting scheduled, and there should be in person classes again this year. So if you're interested, the first one is in January. Go to impressionsexpo.com, and the Long Beach link will take you to what's going on in California there. I am doing several sessions at Long Beach. This may or may not be subject to change, so go ahead and check that out with Impressions Expo. Should be as we have it set here so far. I'm going to be bringing back my small run patches class and teach that there. That's something they asked me to do. Going over some 3D foam techniques, so some basics, but some more advanced stuff as well as we get into it. So getting people started up with 3D foam. Embroidery lettering and font creation is something I pitched to them a long time ago because I wanted to talk about making fonts, not just making lettering, but will be lettering tips as well as how to deal with fonts and why I think it's important. And editing for non-digitizers. So for those who aren't digitizing but do need to do some light edits and light changes, need to find out what's wrong with the design, even if you're not going to do the editing yourself, that's one that's helpful for you there. The next set of classes, we're going to be doing the 2 sessions this time around. We usually do 3 DAX shows a year. So far, they only have 2. Minnesota DAX show looks like it's off the table, but the Kansas City DAX show in February is going off, and I don't know for sure the dates on the Chicagoland, Illinois one, but the Tinley Park, Chicagoland DAX show is also already booked. And in that case, I'm doing the longer workshop, and this is for people who are brand new to digitizing. If they've just started digitizing your first design, founding your foundations, where I'm going to talk about the foundational knowledge you need to digitize and run people through some basics about distortion and tools that are available and how materials react and things like that. The kind of things you need to make your very first design. People have been wanting some 101 basic content. If you need that basic content, this is a long workshop length, multiple hours, so 3 hours of content at least. Happening over at DAX. So that's digitizing your first design, founding your foundations. And then I'm doing another one on design editing. And this is not only editing, but alterations. So you can make basic changes and make more out of the designs that you have if you are not digitizing yourself, how to do the editing, when to do the editing, and how to add or subtract or do other alterations to make your designs more versatile. And that's something that's going to be a shorter kind of hour and 20 minutes, much like the length of this show that I'll be doing at DAX as well. So that's what's going on for me. Check those out. Like I said, impressionsexpo.com for the January show. Lots going down there. And then the daxshow.com for the Kansas City and the Illinois pieces. So yeah, check that out. If you want to see me live, that is one way to do it. I'll also just be at those shows. So if you just want to hang out and say hi, if you appear at the Long Beach show, the Kansas City DAX show, or the Chicagoland Tinley Park show, you have a chance to catch me out in the on the trade show floor and in the hallways and ask me questions. And as always, I welcome you to do so. So with that, folks, I'm going to go ahead and head out. I actually wait. Couple more things. First. Kathy says, "Enjoyable. Thanks. Thank you, Kathy." Cindy says, "Thank you for teaching the great techniques." Thank you, Cindy, for showing up. Frank says, "Great episode." Thank you, Frank, for being here and sharing. And then Faye says, "Any online classes?" Actually, yes. There are a couple online classes I have through the decorators community. And let me see if I can pull that up for you guys before I head out. On the decorators community, I do have Demystifying Next Level Digitizing. And that's one where I talk about digitizing technique and essentially breaking down art and getting dimension out of stuff. That's really where I'm at for that. So Decorators Community has that. And then they also have a version of my patch class that I've done. And it's a long class where, once again, it's basic digitizing of patches, basic work on how those are put together, certainly, but it goes into more on that. It goes into all the different techniques you might use for cutting, adhering, edging, what have you. And it goes into it goes further on into markets, how you market patches, things like that. I will go ahead and throw that in the comments after I get done here because I've got to go look up exactly where those are at. But yeah, Decorators Community does have those, and they are now in a recorded form. They were live like this, both of them long sessions, like 3 hour long sessions. I believe actually 4 hours. We went into bonus time, but they are online with Decorators Community, and I'll make sure and get those into the comments at the end of this so you can check that out. But yeah, there are online classes, and as always, if you have questions, if you have comments, you have things you'd like to see me teach, things you'd like me to do, go ahead and contact me here, contact me via social media, leave something in the comments, and I cannot wait to see you guys again.